Okay, thank you very much for coming to my talk. This is basically a brief summary of some of the key points that Anna Villar and I addressed during a SERISS training seminar course that we gave in Ljubljana in 2016. The course was entitled Designing Questionnaires for Cross-Cultural Surveys. So this was basically about how to produce and develop a source questionnaire, and later on how to translate such a questionnaire in order to ensure comparability. And in this brief talk, I'm going to focus on just some key aspects, notably concerning translation. You could talk a lot, you could basically talk the entire day about translation, but I want to focus on translation assessment processes, because these processes are supposed to ensure good quality, they are supposed to ensure comparability in the translation. So some of you may already heard about good practice approaches, possibly about the term team approach, but some of you may also heard about the acronym TRAPD, T-R-A-P-D. It stands for Translation, Review, Adjudication, Pretesting, and Documentation. Some other terms that are used for essentially the same model are team translation or committee translation. And I want to talk about this model TRAPD in the coming slides to introduce you to this good practice translation method. TRAPD is essentially firmly linked to Janet Harkness and to the European Social Survey. TRAPD was the model that has been used in the European Social Survey since 2002 for translating comparable questionnaires. It is widely uptaken in the cross-cultural research community in exactly the same form as Janet Harkness and colleagues described it, or in modified forms. So the key elements of these of this model, TRAPD, or of the team approach, are essentially that this is a multi-step process. So it's not just translation and the translation is done. It's a couple of steps following upon each other to ensure comparability and accuracy and high quality. Another key element is that there's a team working together, that there's cooperation between the different members of staff working together. It is very important that there are different experts from different fields that are brought to this model. And finally, another key element is that is not just the, I would say, subjective translation, but also some empirical testing among the target population. So this is just, in short, the key elements of TRAPD, or the team approach. And here you can see the model as it was originally developed by Janet Harkness and colleagues. And already from this small model, you see that there is a particularity. You've got a source instrument, and this source instrument or source questionnaire gets translated into 2 translations. So that is a particularity. And I'm going to talk about this now on the next slide. And I'm also talking about all the other steps that you can see in this model. So let us now first focus on the translation step, which is essentially parallel translation. Sometimes it's also called double translation, double forward translations. So you take a source questionnaire, and this source questionnaire gets translated by 2 different translators. These translators work independently from each other, so there is no exchange at that stage. So why do we have two translations of the same source questionnaire? So having different translation versions to choose from is something very important. We know from monocultural and monolingual research that different wording may matter, even though it doesn't matter in all the cases. But of course, the same applies to questionnaire translations. Different wording may matter. And so it's very important to have different wordings, different options to choose from, and to choose what we think is best in terms of validity or reliability, and on top of that, comparability. I just want to give you one example how what it could mean to have 2 different versions to choose from, and what actually means in terms of detecting errors. So this is an example from the EU project UCROSS. It was about, the target group was essentially migrants, Turkish and Romanian migrants in different European countries. And there was, in the socio-demographic section of the questionnaire, there was a question asking, do you currently have a partner? And we had 2 translations offered in Turkish. I do not speak Turkish, but I have to trust my translators now. We had 2 different translations, and one of the translation essentially meant or asked, do you currently have a spouse? So that actually referred to married couples. And the other translation was more open. It asked whether this person, this respondent, is actually currently in a relationship with someone. And that was much more in line with the intended goal, because the English source is wider. It doesn't really ask or focus only on spouses, those that are married. So this gives you some of the examples that you can uncover when having 2 different versions to compare. So I've just talked about the translation part now. So let's move on to the next step, which is called review in the Janet Harkness trap model. So review actually means that there is a discussion taking place based on the 2 forward or draft translations that the translators have produced. The goal is to produce a final translation or a final pretest translation by jointly discussing the different options, the different translation versions provided. And this is essentially done, and this is one of the core elements in the review stage. This is essentially done in a team. So you bring together the translators, those that have translated the questionnaire. You bring together question design experts, those who know about the concepts and the study goals. And the idea is, by bringing together these different people, you have all the knowledge available that it needs for producing a good and comparable translation. Giving you a couple of more examples, what to look out for when having such a team discussion. You've seen the example before about, do you currently have a partner? But another example could be to look out for for meaning or for obvious misinterpretations, such as in this example, that's from a publication X, so that is supposed to be a name of a person. My boss or my supervisor tells me how I'm doing, and that got translated as my boss or my supervisor m'aide, me corrige, which essentially means my boss helps me or corrects me, which is not the same as my boss helps me how I'm doing. So these kind of things could be easily, hopefully easily be detected when there are 2 different versions that can be compared. Another example to look out for when looking at question translations is meaningful elements that are meaningful for measurement. So we have in all these source items, we have little terms and phrases such as in general, on average, during the past 2 weeks, rarely, often, etc., etc. Tiny words and phrases that may sometimes get easily forgotten or that are ignored, or sometimes the person doesn't see the meaning of it, but they are essential for measurement. And so it's important to make sure that these little words that provide a temporal or spatial or conceptual framework for the respondents, that they stay in the translation, that they are not lost in the translation. So this is also something to look out for when translating, when reconciling translation versions. But these are just 2 examples. There's a whole lot of list of things that need to be looked at, such as fluency and consistency and important response scale features, etc. So in such a review discussion, when you bring together the translators, when you bring together question design experts, those who know about the study, how does such a review discussion, what does it look like? Essentially, one item item on the item level, the different translations that are provided, they are discussed. It could be that both translations are suitable and that the team may decide, well, it's okay, we can use both translations. It could be that one of the translations is better, so of course one will go for this translation. It could be that there is a decision to combine the translations because they essentially both have very good features. It could be that those sitting on the review board, that they decide that we have to produce a completely different translation. The translations that have been provided by the translators are not good enough, they don't meet the measurement goals. And of course, whatever decision is taken here, always the previous decisions, the translations that have been decided on before, all of this needs to be taken into account. So the message that I want to get across here is that once there is this kind of review stage, when I've got 2 translations, it's not just about choosing A or B. What is needed is a very considerate and thoughtful kind of reworking, looking, comparing translations, and always be willing to produce a completely new translations, because one notices that the translations offered are simply not good enough given all the discussion input that one has produced during such a review discussion. So after such a review discussion, there may be a what is called adjudication step. Basically, adjudication stands for the final decision-making step. So what is actually happens at this step is that issues that couldn't be resolved during the review stage, that they can be resolved at this stage. So maybe the team wasn't knowledgeable enough about the concept. They didn't know exactly how to understand a certain term in light of the construct. So they need to go back to the question developers to ask for further information. The team may want to ask other colleagues so that they can provide further input. So whatever is happening at this stage, it could be that some additional information needs to be considered to make like kind of final decision on the questionnaire. It could also be that a person who did not take part in the team discussion actually wants to sign off the final translation. This also could happen at this adjudication step. It's just for you to be aware that after a review discussion, that there may be a final decision-making step. And I want to add actually, and possibly even expand the model. What is needed as well is that there is a thorough proofreading step, including consistency checks, spelling checks, etc. So that the translation that is finally actually produced also adheres to linguistic norms, correctness, etc. And be aware, depending on the complexity of a source questionnaire, this final proofreading step may be quite time consuming as well. And for this reason, I want to also name it as an important step in the entire process. I've talked a bit about the different people that should bring their skills to the entire endeavor. So here's now a slide on the skill sets of the different people. So we've got the translators. Those who produce the first draft or forward translation. They should be skilled translation practitioners. Those that have some experience in translating from the source language into the target language. They should translate into their mother tongue. They should ideally have experience in translating questionnaire translations, but I know that this is difficult because we don't have that many translators on the market who are used to translating questionnaires. So they should receive some briefing on questionnaires, on the extent or on the kind of things that should be heeded when producing questionnaire translations. I will later on talk about the briefing of translators. The reviewers, they should have some sort of translation competence, even though they don't need to be skilled translation practitioners, but they should have a thorough knowledge of the source and the target language. And they actually bring in the additional knowledge of the study, of the topic, of the constructs, and ideally also of questionnaire design. So they are often the more substantive experts and questionnaire design methods experts. The adjudicator actually is often the same person as the reviewer. The adjudicator also brings in the additional knowledge of the study of the topic, so also is often a kind of substantive or questionnaire design expert. But it's important overall that these different people work together so that in the end we have translation competence covered, but we also have methods competence in terms of the questionnaire design and also the substantive competence and knowledge covered in such a team approach. So we've now covered the source instrument and the different translations. We've covered how to move on from the translation to the review stage and to the adjudication stage. I now want to focus on documentation. As you can see in the model, this is a kind of very important step that accompanies the entire process from the beginning till the end. And what do I mean by translation documentation? So translation documentation should happen on two levels. So first of all, we have the micro level. We have the level of the actual translation. So translators, reviewers, adjudicators, whoever is involved in producing the actual translation should comment translation problems or decisions or deliberate deviations in the translations, cultural adaptations. They should document that in a special column or in a special field. I'll show you an example in a moment. Why should this be documented? So the example of the translator, for instance, if they document special problems or decisions, this information can be passed on to the next step, so that all of this information is available for the team at the review stage. This improves basically efficiency, so that the wheel doesn't have to be reinvented at the next step. And also, in particular, when the final translation gets annotated in terms of these things, so problems and how these were solved, or particular adaptations or deviations, if you have this information available for the final translation, that increases transparency. And it also can be very important later on when there are statistical analyses on the data and potential problems come up, and these may be linked later on to translation problems. So one can go back to the documentation and see whether the translation itself was already difficult and challenging. So there may be a link between these challenges during the translation and later on the results in the statistical data. So this is documentation on the micro level, but there's also documentation on the macro level. And by this I mean that research teams should document how they actually produce the translation. So what kind of procedures they employed, what double translation, what kind of pretesting, what kind of stuff was used, what was the experience of the translators, reviewers. This information is really important later. Oh, cut. I made a mistake. Okay, so there's information on the macro level. This is about translation assessment processes. So translation teams should document what kind of procedures they've employed. So that's double translation or what kind of pretesting. They should specify the background or the experience of translators, reviewers, etc. This is the kind of information that is needed on the one hand in kind of study documentation, but also on the other hand in research papers. That is actually something that is often deplored in research papers, that there's hardly any information on how a translation was produced, even though the translation procedures are a kind of first indicator for the quality or for the comparability of a question translation. So the message for you, documentation is very important. Let us now move on to the next slide that gives you an example of how a documentation could look like on the micro level. So this is an Excel. You see column D is basically the source text, in this case in German. You see column E is the translation into English. Column F, we had some additional help and annotations for the translators, things to consider and to look out for when doing the translation. And the next column, G, is really about comments, feedback from the translators. So here in this case, there is a term in German, it's called sozialstaatliche Leistung, and the translator wasn't sure how to translate that into English for the US context, whether it should be social security benefits, social welfare benefits, or state benefits. So these were different options that the translator considered, and she gave us a lot of information about the different connotations and the different meaning components, so that later on at the next step, when there was this kind of review discussion, a good and appropriate translation option could be chosen. This is just how such a documentation may look like in Excel. Let me now move on to the next step, to pretesting. That is a very important component of the TRAP model. Pretesting actually means that you go to the target population, you see how it actually works, the translated questionnaire, how it works with the target population. There's a very famous quote applying to general questionnaires, but well, it can apply to translated questionnaires as well. If you do not have the resources to pilot test your questionnaire, don't do the study. And the P in the model TRAP actually shows and brings this it shows how important this step is also for translation. There are different possibilities how you can pretest a translated questionnaire. There is the qualitative assessment, which is typically cognitive pretests. What happens during these cognitive pretests is that you select a number of items, those that possibly key items in a survey or those that were really difficult during translation, where you had a lot of problems finding an appropriate translation, where you were uncertain whether the translation is appropriate. And you probe. So you administer that question and you ask follow-up questions, for instance, on the meaning of a term or how the respondent arrived at their answers. And by using the answers from the respondent, you actually try to understand whether the question measures what it is supposed to measure, whether it is comparable to the source, etc. So that is one possibility to assess key items from your questionnaire. This is important here. Often you only have small samples, so between 5 and 15 respondents. So this is typically a qualitative analysis that takes place at this step. To give you one example from Willis et al., it is the tobacco use special cessation supplement to the current population survey. So this is the US context, and amongst others, this questionnaire needed to be translated into Vietnamese for this group, ethnic group in the United States. One of the source questions was, in your opinion, how easy is it for minors to buy cigarettes and other tobacco products in your community? And what they actually found out during cognitive interviewing is that the Vietnamese translation for community tended to be interpreted as the Vietnamese people in general, which was actually not the goal of the question. So they considered different translation options in the Vietnamese language. So for instance, an equivalent to neighborhood, but they also thought that this might be problematic because it could imply some sort of relationship to neighbors. And the final translation is, or was, in your opinion, how easy is it for a minor to buy cigarettes or cigarette products in the area where you are now living? As you can see, I go back for a second. So we've got the source in your community, and that actually got translated into Vietnamese in the area where you're now living. That was the best way that they could find and identify for getting across this concept of in your community. And that was actually cognitive interviewing helped to uncover this kind of possible misunderstanding and to find a solution in line with the measurement goal. So besides qualitative assessment, we have quantitative assessment. Here we have field tests or pilot studies, and the goal is during this quantitative assessment to administer the entire questionnaire, to simulate the real survey interview, to check lengths, for instance, to see how interviewers cope with the administration of the questionnaire, to identify respondent problems in the field, to look out for sequence effects, to test the survey interview, depending on the sample size, to do first statistical analyses, possibly to run experiments, to have interviewer-respondent debriefings. You can see there are a lot of different things that you can test and assess using field tests, larger field tests and pilot studies. And with larger samples, of course, this allows for quantitative analysis compared to qualitative assessment. So these are just the kind of very briefly two slides, or these were two slides about the pretesting possibilities. As a wrap up, this was basically kind of summary of the trapped translation model, which includes the development of source questionnaire, the translation in basically the production of two translations, and then team processes that help to produce a final translation that can go into a pretest, and you document this entire process. So that is the trap model. The second part of our presentation, I want to briefly focus on different contexts of questionnaire translation, because I've noticed that often people think, oh, questionnaire translation, it can't be that difficult. There's possibly only one translation that can be produced, but there are many different translations that can be produced. There is no just one universal translation. So translation, questionnaire translation, that depends on different factors and different requirements. So here you can see a table that essentially on the right-hand side We have the requirement of comparability, so that you aim for, when you produce a question translation, that you aim for comparability, for possibly pooling of data, etc. And on the left-hand side, you see different conditions of how a source questionnaire can be produced. And all of this, if you combine these different conditions, that actually has an effect on how you can translate, or to what extent you have to adapt, or to what extent you're allowed to adapt. I want to zoom in now on this first cell. This is basically how questionnaires are produced and translated in many large-scale cross-national surveys, such as the ESS, the EBS, the WVS, the ISSP. So essentially what happens in these surveys, you've got a source questionnaire that is already developed in view of translatability and cultural relevance for the different countries. So the teams, or those working on the source questionnaire, they produce a translation or a source instrument that is as translatable as possible, that is culturally relevant in the different countries participating in the study. They add notes, translation notes to the source questionnaire, so that key terms or difficult, challenging terms are explained for translators. They earmark items for adaptations where they think their countries may need to adapt items. But other than that, countries are supposed to translate questionnaires. So it is thought that once you do a very thorough and considerate development of the source questionnaire and prepare it for its cross-cultural implementation, countries can translate it and only adapt it where kind of basically they have been given the possibility to adapt it. If you compare it to the other situation, and that is kind of the bottom line here, often questionnaires get translated and adapted that were not developed with a view to cross-cultural implementation. So in particular in health research, in particular in cross-cultural psychology, instruments are taken for use in one's country that have been developed for another culture, for another context. So in order to bring this questionnaire instrument across into your culture and context, you often have to adapt these instruments to a greater extent. You have to be aware that you may need to adapt them to a greater extent, since they were simply not meant at the beginning to be used in your own culture and language. So adaptations are likely, and you need to be aware of that. But still, if you want to compare results, to pool results later on, there is a kind of limit to what you can adapt and what you should adapt. And if you don't have any comparability in mind, later on there is a lot of freedom. There is a lot of freedom in terms of the adaptations that can be undertaken. It's just important for you to know that depending on how and where a source questionnaire was developed, this will have an effect on the extent to which adaptations are possible, allowed, or even needed. There's a fifth type of translation, question translation, which I want to call documentary translation. This is a translation that is not meant to be used as a field instrument. So for instance, the German General Social Survey, the ALBUS, regularly gets translated into the English language, but not so that it can be implemented in the UK, the US, or another English language country, but rather gets translated so that researchers who don't know German, so who cannot read the German instrument in the German language, so that they actually know what the German instrument is all about. So this is essentially a documentary translation. And in translation jargon, the other translations that you've seen on the other slide here, these are all in translation jargon instrumental translations. So they are all meant to collect real data, survey data. Whereas this document translation is simply there as a tool for documentation, to showing others what has happened here in this particular case in the German General Social Survey. the takeaway message for you when it comes to these different contexts of question translation is that there is not a universal translation of a given questionnaire, but a translation and to what extent it will eventually become an adaptation, that really depends on a couple of factors. And amongst which we have the source questionnaire and how that was developed. We've got the research purpose, and we may have other specifications for the translation. And it is important for you, for instance, if you produce a translation, if you ask others to produce a translation for you, that you provide this information, this additional information to translators, so that they can take the adequate decisions when it comes to translation and or adaptation. And so that we all come back to this crucial kind of principle. Translation is a decision-taking process, taking into account a lot of different context factors or translation specifications. It is not this kind of automatic one-to-one transfer, how it is often kind of misunderstood in many different fields. I haven't talked about the importance of providing translators with adequate information. In the translation industry, this is often called the translation brief or translation specifications. So for the special project of a question translation, this translation brief should include information, general information on the study, and information on the questionnaire, including the type of source questionnaire, including the possible leeway for adaptations. So you should provide your translators with some sort of information on these topics. It is also important to specify who the target group is. Just to give you the very simple example of the English language and you, the form of addressing respondents. So in the English language, you only have you. But when it comes to other languages, you may have to make a distinction how you translate the form of addressing you, depending on the age of the respondent or on some other socio-demographic characteristic. So of course, translators will need to know who is my target population. Is it teenagers? Then I may be able to translate the you in a different form compared to when it is an adult population. Translators will need to know about the education level of the target group, about is it their mother tongue, is it a foreign language, any other particularities. Translators will need to know about the survey mode. Is it a web survey, is it a face-to-face survey, is it a phone survey, so that they, once again, you will see a slide later on what actually that means for translation, so that they can align their translation decisions to the survey mode. For instance, in a paper-administered survey, you may have to instruct respondents to make a cross on the paper, but that instruction obviously doesn't work for a web where you indicate in different ways what your response choice is. You may have other specific requirements for the translation. So, for instance, that translator should try to stay consistent with translations in the previous ways, etc., etc. So all of this can or should be put together into a translation brief and, provided to the translators or to the translation team. Just to show you one example about the importance of this translation brief. So one of the requirements, of course, for question translation is that you should produce simple language, clear sentence structures. And when it comes to terminology and wording, you should use the language that is appropriate for the target population. And of course, for this, I will have to know as a translator who is my target population. If the target population is employees in a particular firm, of course, there will be the terminology from the firm will be used. If my target population is the general population in a country, then of course I will have to choose wording and terms that can be understood by respondents of all different kind of ages, education, and people with different socio-demographic characteristics. And the same, of course, applies for the mode. This is an example how in the French language, if it is a paper-administered instrument or possibly a web self-administered instruments, this is how male and female respondents need to be addressed. Si vous êtes marié, you see in brackets the additional E. So essentially both male and female respondents are addressed. Obviously, you would translate this differently if you knew that there is one web survey for male respondents and one web survey for female respondents, right? Then this translation wouldn't be needed. So you will have to know as a translator how this will eventually be implemented in the survey context in order to take the right decisions. So this was basically just a summary of some of the key aspects covered during the SERISS training course on developing questionnaires for cross-cultural surveys. The takeaway messages from this brief summary are, when it comes to producing a translation, strive to the extent possible for a team approach. That means that you will have double translation, that you will implement a team review, that you try to bring together experts who have translation competence, those who know about question design, those who know about the study and about the concepts, and you bring them together so that they can pool their expertise in order to produce a comparable questionnaire translation that is, of course, or at the same time works as a very good measurement instrument. It is important to find ways and resources for pretesting a questionnaire, whether this is qualitative or quantitative. It is important to document your chosen translation approach for the study documentation, but also later on for research papers, so that external users of your data or of your instrument have some sort of quality indicator for your study and for your results. For transparency reasons, and also later on to understand the statistical data better, it would be important to document key decisions in translation. For instance, a couple of problems or necessary adaptations, or if you think that you eventually had to choose a translation that was maybe not the optimal solution, but maybe there was no optimal solution. It is important for you to brief translators and translation teams on the study and on particular translation requirements, because that is needed so that they can take the right translation decisions in line with your research question. And especially if you are in a position or if you're currently writing a project proposal, and if you're in need of a question translation, do plan or allow enough time, money for the different steps, because this is often something that gets neglected once people think that once there's a source questionnaire, it is quite easy to produce the translation. But this translation, producing a good translation, it requires time and money and resources for the different steps. So take that into account and do not forget it. And with this, I would like to close this seminar or this kind of brief summary, and wishing you a good day. And yes, thank you very much.